Hello, I'm Sophia Stein, and I'm a rising senior at Montgomery Blair High School. I'm also a recent participant in Montgomery County's Summer Rise program, where I've been interning at the county executive's office, and I've spent the past few weeks learning all about local government and how public information is disseminated. I'm sitting down today with County Executive Mark Elrich to interview him about his life, his term, and goals moving forward for the county. So, Mr. County Executive, I'd like to start with some questions about your life and getting to know you better. I know you've lived in the county for over 60 years, so most of your life, and I want to know how you think that has made you more prepared to be a leader here and more motivated to create meaningful change in the county.
That's a really good question. First place, my experience in the county came in moving out of Washington, D.C. And so one of the first things that I discovered more intensely was the change in racial relations in going from the district to Montgomery County. The intensity of racism was a lot more here, and I experienced it differently. And I grew up with a fair amount of anti-Semitism too, which is ironic because I hadn't even stepped foot in a synagogue. It was an interesting start to being here as a 10-year-old. I liked the schools, but the schools were pretty much all white, and I felt like I had good educational opportunities. I always liked to learn, so I was one of these strange children who took summer school because I wanted to get extra classes that I couldn't fit into my regular year, and I like that a lot. I think being here through those kind of changes, which are kind of critical, they were critical for the county, they were critical for the country, gave me like a long-term lens. So when I look at race relations today, I have at least a long-term perspective on what they used to be like and how people talked and what the prevailing feelings were. So it gives me a lens through which to kind of see present-day Montgomery County. I think the same thing about the changing demographic, going from a county which did not have large amounts of really obvious poverty to a county that has a fair amount of lower-income households that struggle. And so that wasn't what I grew up with, but it's certainly something that I began to see as I got older here. My kids all went to Montgomery County schools, and so I experienced the schools as a student. I experienced them as the parent of students, and then I experienced them as a teacher of students. And I always thought the schools were some of the most important work we do. A lot of my motivation for wanting to get on the council was to have a greater role in making sure that schools got adequately funded and they were prioritized how I thought they should be in the budget. So I'd say just in general that being here for a long time and seeing the changes and working with lots of different people broadened my look on things. I got to see lots of different people's views of the world and work with a lot of different people. So I feel lucky to have had that experience.
Absolutely. And I know you've talked a lot about wanting to go from a role of activism to more of a role of having power to really create that change. Can you talk a little bit about what made you want to go from public service in the form of teaching to an elected position?
So there are a couple of things that happened to me. I used to work at the co-op in Tacoma Park, and I went to a co-op conference in Minneapolis. When we were in Minneapolis, we went to meet Acorn in the city, their community organizing group. And we were talking to them. They were talking about their experience of having been really involved in a political campaign, and then and probably being the ground troops that helped this person get elected. When he got elected and they went to meet with him to talk about the agenda, he said, well, you're just one of many people I have to listen to, and kind of dismiss them. And that conversation kind of evolved to talking about we need to start electing people who think like us instead of electing people who don't think like us. So, instead of somebody who's never been involved in community organizing but claims to be interested, organize people who've actually been involved in community organizing. People who have more than an intellectual or political interest in it, but people who have actually done it as a life's work. And I got involved. I'd moved to Tacoma Park around 1980, and I got involved in local politics. Before that, I was involved in things like the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, keeping the U.S. out of Central America, anti-nukes, all those things. But Tacoma Park was my first brush with real local elected. And I realized there, and then when I started testifying in front of the council, that that public testimony was meaningless, because you realize people already made up their mind and what they were going to do, and they have to go through public testimony, so they endure the public testimony, and then they do what they were going to do anyway. And there were times when people would do public testimony and then immediately vote. So if you handed them a document that you wanted them to read, that there was no way they read that document before they voted. Right. So it made me think, combined with my other little trip, that what I really wanted to be on the podium so I could listen to people and help bring voice to the things that people were raising, as opposed to just being in the audience and being ignored. And so that motivated me. So I got elected to the Park Council, and then in 2006 I got elected to the County Council. But I've always, I see myself more as an activist than a politician. My job is not to be rah, partisan politics. Everything is the Democratic Party. I'm a Democrat, but that's not the focus of my job. The focus of my job is to solve problems and try to make people's lives better. And sometimes the two don't always jive. So I always opt for the people side of that.
That's wonderful, yeah. So from your time on the city council to then the county council and now in the position of the county executive, who have been some people that have guided your leadership style and served as an inspiration? This could be anybody.
I mean, there are a couple local people I thought were really important. Blair used to be on the school board. He was also a council member here. He had a lot of courage. He was often opposed by the same people in the development community that aren't fond of me. So Blair and I had real similar interests, but we also had a real similar interest in education and an understanding of the county budget as the tool by which education would either rise to what it was capable of or would not go where it was capable of going. So he was really important. Roscoe Nix was a leader in the African American community here. He was very outspoken, and what I was impressed with was they made it very clear to politicians that if politicians didn't pay attention, there'd actually be consequences. And you knew that Roscoe would organize, and you knew that you might see protests, and you knew that you didn't want him organizing against you. And I looked at that and I thought, this is the way things need to be done. People need to be more than just passive supplicants and say, gee, I wish you'd think about this. And then when nobody listens to you, you just go away and say, oh, well. It's like Roscoe never would have gone away and said, oh, well. Roscoe would have persisted. Yeah. So he was a really important voice. Later I got to know Marilyn Praisner, and I just appreciated her due diligence, the amount of work she put in, the amount of time she spent getting engaged in what were the core issues. Didn't always agree with her on everything. She didn't always agree with me, but I think that her work ethic was pretty astounding, and I really appreciated that. So those are local people that I got to look at and say, okay, this is what somebody could do if they were in a position, and I got to say it.
Being here for so long, witnessing change and maybe setbacks and reform on so many different issues, what would you say have been the main shifts in your own political ideology over time?
I don't know that my ideology has shifted as much as like a clearer understanding. Like, I know my political views are different than a lot of people's political views, but advancing causes, making things better, doesn't rely on a particular political prescription. And so I've always focused on what can I do, not what would be the ideal. You would lose a lot of battles in the search of the ideal, whereas you could actually make real progress. And I didn't think it was good to lose ground you could make over trying to be a purist. So I think I've become less of a purist, though I was never pure, because I wouldn't have engaged in elected politics if I was. I always understood you had to get to a larger number of votes. When I was on the council in Tacoma Park, I would have been like a one-vote minority on the council I got elected to. And I realized I could keep pushing what I wanted and I would lose every single vote, every 6-1 or whatever it was. That was not very productive. So I worked on building coalitions, worked on issues that weren't necessarily my issues, but were important to other people, and I saw how they were important to other people. And I thought that one way of getting people's trust is when they see that you're working on something that matters to them. That, you know, you don't trivialize it, you don't dismiss it, but you realize this really does matter to people. And so that got me, I'd say, much more engaged and more broadly, and that introduced me to a whole range of issues that I never would have thought about, but which were important to people in the community. So it was a good experience in growing that way. I don't think that there's any ideology where you can turn to a page in some book and say, here's the solution to the problem. I would say I'm kind of a believer in a third way that, you know, this whole notion of being trapped, you know, it's either capitalism or socialism or whatever you want to call it. It's like, let's say one's an 18th century ideology and the other's a 19th century ideology, and we're in the 21st century, and why are we incapable of asking ourselves questions, and how would you solve them, and focusing on how do you solve a problem, rather than saying, does it conform with this belief set or that belief set? So I've become a lot less concerned about conformity with belief sets. Principles are different, but you know, why you do things don't change. I'm motivated by everything I was motivated by before. I think I have a different understanding of how to get there.
I see. So it's about fluidity, it sounds like. Important to be flexible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I mean, you live in a changing world, and you have to, well, you have to be able to change. And if you know, what is the point of always battering your head against the wall if you can't ever produce an outcome you want?
Exactly.
It's kind of futile,
Yeah.
possibly painful.